We took a huge pause there. So in the 80s,
Sure did.
we have this huge resurgence, a lot of creativity going into horror films. The slasher kind of becomes a thing. We move into the 90s, and we see with the Scream franchise.
Hmm.
Again, Wes Craven kind of takes the horror genre. Everything that we think we know about it flips it on its head. Kind of pulls an Alfred Hitchcock and kills Drew Barrymore right out of the gate. In the first film, you're
Oh,
like, hey,
cool.
Drew Barrymore, one of the biggest stars of the world right now. She's in this brand new horror film, and she's dead within the first, 5 minutes or 3 minutes of the
You
movie?
know, I've watched Scream with a couple of my filmmaking friends, and we really pick that movie apart because as funny as it is, as witty as it is, it really does well with the scares. And we were watching particularly the opening scene with Drew
Yeah.
Barrymore, and we were all saying this scene is really unsettling. What is it about this that makes it so unsettling? Like more so than a lot of other movies we were watching at the time. And it's a combination of different things. One is that the house has a ton of windows and it's dark outside. So you know she's being watched. But another neat thing about that, and the way that film is shot, is that anytime she gets up and moves, the camera is advancing on her. Like anytime she turns away from the camera, it moves in a little closer. So when she's walking down a hallway, the camera is actually moving up behind her.
Weird.
And it's
Oh, cool.
really cool trick that's like really a masterful move from either the director or cinematographer. I don't know whose decision that was, but it's really brilliant.
Wow.
And it just does a great job of setting up the movie. And of course, the fact that first her boyfriend gets killed.
Yeah.
Uh, you see him out on the porch and he's all tied up, and then you see him sliced open and his guts literally spill out. You go, wow, anything can happen in this movie, which is something that
It
um,
means you're not safe.
really
To the viewer, you're not safe.
no. No, I mean that was 1996. That was kind of deep into the 90s, but that feeling of unease was new. That wasn't something that was in the 80s horror movies, and I think a lot of that came from we had a lot of you had Jeffrey Dahmer show up in the
Mm.
1990s, which was kind of like, oh my God, how could this happen? This was just like
Jeffrey
the normal
Dahmer
quiet guy.
in the 90s?
Yeah,
I
yeah, he was like the normal quiet guy in the neighborhood, and he was eating people and chewing them up and so movies got in the 90s they kind of went away from the big special effects boom apart from Jurassic Park and kind of collapsed inward and got smaller and smaller and smaller to like personal things, inside things. You had both Jacob's Ladder and Misery in the
Yeah.
in 19 who were which were psychological films. Jacob's Ladder larger in scope, but all pretty much inside of his head. And you've got Misery, which is just a movie with honestly three people in it. It could have been a stage
Mm.
play. Would make an excellent stage play. Um, and then by 1991, you've got Silence of the Lambs, which is one of the first like really high end horror movies, like actually almost like art house horror, which is a much more common thing now. But you had like it was almost a prestige picture, like,
Well, it
oh
was
man, this
because
is
it
gonna
won
win.
Best Picture at the Oscars.
Right, right, and it should have. It's an incredible film, but it was the first time that it was really a big leap for horror films to go from something that like critics had just panned to like them going, wow, crap, this is actually really good. Maybe we should pay attention. You know, uh, so the twist ending kind of came into play
Mm.
with films like Silence of the
Yeah.
Lambs, and then you also got all of the security of the 80s that we had, all the like everything's great, all things are great. You've got the disillusionment of Generation X, my generation in the 1990s, going, everything's great. Why am I so miserable? Why am I still not feeling good? You've got movies like Seven, which is all about that underbelly.
Ooh. Oh, so good.
Everything's perfect. It's not. Everything's wrong. Everything's
Yeah.
bad. And it's right underneath the surface. And if you just lift up that little piece of paper, you'll see it. You'll see all the worms crawling around in there. That's what Seven's all about. And that's what Fight Club's about, too, which comes out in the same year.
Well, in the
So,
90s, we also kind of see a little bit of an emergence of like the psychological thriller slash horror because that even that line got started getting blurred quite a bit. I guess it's arguable that Psycho 1959 or I guess 1960 was a psychological thriller. But in the late '90s, we're seeing films like Fight Club, we're seeing Seven, we're seeing The Sixth Sense, and then we start like getting into the early 2000s, and we see films like Saw, which is, it's not so much of it's kind of a psychological thriller, but it's more just complete gruesome horror.
Yeah, you got Hostel, you got
yeah.
the Rise of Torture Porn. And that comes out of too, like, how do we shock people anymore? Like, are people just unshockable? Let's see how far we can push that. Let's see how gross we can make something, and at the same time examine our insatiable need for filth.
Yeah.
And that, those also kind of like attack the kind of button up perfection personality that you also see in American Psycho, where you're like, everything's perfect on the outside, but if you just lift up the cover just a little and look underneath, right there in that thin little space, there's murder and mayhem and blood and guts and all sorts of horrible things.
So if I can address like some of the movies like Saw and Hostel, and like the really gruesome like body horror, but like extreme body horror movies. Horror films are always a reflection of the times that we live in. What is it that those films are saying about 2000, late 2000s, 2010s?
Helplessness. Think about what happened right at the beginning of 2000. You have 9/11. You have a president that didn't win, but still won. Whatever you want to make of that politically, it was one of the first presidents to ever win by not winning. He lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College. And then right after that, you have 9/11. Now, the only thing that I could relate to when 9/11 happened, which was a moment of, well, you all remember where you were, was when the Challenger blew up. That was immediately what I flashed back to, because I wasn't alive when JFK was shot. I wasn't alive during the Vietnam War. So for my generation, that was the first real shock, and it was something that we all immediately came together on. When that happened, I don't know how old you were at the time, but I was in my 20s, and I got a call from my parents, and they told me what happened, and then immediately you're on the phone to everybody else, and all you can do is just watch the TV.
Yeah.
And so everything changes, and we have the idea of helplessness. We have the idea of terrorism. We have this feeling of complete loss of control. In the 80s, you've got everything's great, and I'm going to invest in the stock market, and I'm going to buy a yacht, and things are good, and I've got all the women and all the cocaine I want. And in the 90s, you're like, I did all the things I was supposed to do. And like what Seven says, or I'm sorry, not Seven, but Fight Club says, I did all the things that I'm supposed to do, and I'm still helpless. I still feel helpless. I still feel out of control. And so a lot of those movies that start to happen then are movies about nameless enemies, an apocalypse that you can't quite get a grip on. You've got 2000 opens with Final Destination, which is about how no matter what you do,
forgot about that.
No matter
series.
what you do, death is going to get you, and if you're marked, you're gonna die. So that positivity kind of starts to dissolve until by the end of the decade, you've got a film like The Mist, which is a deeply cynical film. I mean, it's
that was
brilliant
Thomas Jane. He was the star of that film, right?
Thomas Jane, yeah. Thomas Jane, Marcia Gay Harden, and
half the cast of The Walking Dead.
You're right, right. And that Frank Darabont wrote that movie, even though it's based on a Stephen King story, in a large part in response to how people were feeling about the Gulf War. Again, body snatchers. The idea that you have these monsters coming out of the mist, and you can't control them, and you don't know what they are. But even worse than that are the humans that you're stuck inside with. They're changing. They're becoming something else. They're being body snatched. And I remember when I saw that at the time, I felt, after it was over, I felt just wrecked by it. Completely wrecked by it. And I won't spoil the ending for anybody of our 3 viewers that haven't seen it.
We currently have 4 people watching the show right now, so go us!
awesome. Yeah. Okay. But um, it's a very cynical film, and when I saw it, I was pretty much bowled away. I was like, that was a great movie, but I'm pretty well wrecked. And in the ensuing years, I watched it a couple times and had the same feeling. And now I watched it. I watched it about 2 weeks ago. And was like, that is a perfect
It's
film.
pretty great.
That's an
It's pretty
absolutely
great.
perfect film. And like I've said, like the best allegory is always true or only becomes more true. And that one certainly has become more true, if anything, where you have your friends and neighbors, people you've known your whole life, turn against you and become this zombie mob. They become zombies, which in this case they're worse than zombies because they're thinking
Yeah.
zombies. You know,
Mm-hmm.
they're decision making zombies, and they've all changed, and they've all decided that collectively we are one, and you're bad and we're good, and you know that they've drawn that division line. So
So
that's
let's move forward a little bit. Currently, in our current state, we have I guess you could call it a classic. I mean, it's as soon as it came out, I felt like this movie was like the quintessential horror film, which was Stephen King's It. We
yeah,
have
yeah.
or not a remake, but the sequel to The Shining, which we didn't even talk about The Shining earlier. We have the sequel to The Shining,
No,
Doctor Sleep. We have a lot of Jordan Peele properties coming out or that have come out. A lot of social commentary that is meant to be social commentary in the guise of horror. We even have television shows on TV right now like Lovecraft Country that harkens back to
yeah,
the old school, like early 19 teens horror, mystical fantasy horror, but in a new context that
yeah,
addresses like the racist problems that have happened throughout the decades, and how we like what it is, not what we can do to help fight some of these things. But I think properties like that, like even though I'm not a fan of the show Lovecraft Country, I actually think it's not a very good show in
haven't watched
storytelling
it yet.
wise. I think I'm the only person on the planet who thinks this. Just narratively, I think it's terrible. But the interesting thing about the state, like the social consciousness that we currently live in, and with a show like Lovecraft Country, I think it's very, very smart and very clever to use racism as the horror. Like that is the horror. It's not the monsters coming
Yeah,
up out of the ground that are, gonna kill us, that are scary. It's the evil that people do to other people. And I think
yeah.
that's the message. Is that the message of horror films now, or is it more complex? Is there something else?
It it has always been the message because we're always the monsters, and we've always been the monsters. I mean, there's no troll living up in the mountains. You know, uh, there's no monster living in the deep lake. There's no vampires, really. Honestly, there's no mummy. Horror movies are always
There's
about
a
us.
classic episode of The Twilight Zone from the 1959, 1960. I can't remember what season it is. It might be in the first season. Doesn't matter. It's called "The Monsters Are Living on Maple Street." Have you
Monsters
seen it?
are due on Maple Street. It's my
Monsters
favorite
are due on
Twilight.
Maple Street.
And
And the
again,
whole town is just, they're a buzz waiting for these monsters to come, or aliens or something. They think something is coming to get them. And as
hmm,
they can't figure out what to do with themselves, so they start fighting amongst each other.
right,
And the arguing
right.
turns into fist fighting, and the fist fighting turns into like burning houses down and cars on fire. And that's when we come to realize, and I'm totally going to spoil the ending, which, I mean, let's be honest, you should have seen it coming when I started this, is that
Right.
there are no monsters. And it's the people, it's the neighbors. We are the ones who inflict evil upon each other.
But better yet, the camera moves out to the aliens that have landed, and they're sitting on a hill,
Oh, that's
and
right.
just
Yeah.
say, "See, you just put them at it, and they do it themselves. They do it to themselves. You just introduce a little bit of chaos, and they do the rest."
Yeah.
I mean that's the word that's what Russia was trying to do in the last 4 years, which is not take over, sow chaos, and let us do it. You know, that's the monster in the horror movie is always us. and we just as easily can be the monster as fight the monster. And that's really something that ties all of them together. I would say that right now we are living in the golden age of horror. I think there have been better horror films made in the last 15 years than we've ever seen. You've got small little movies like The Conjuring, which looks like, oh yeah, that looks like it's a goofy little ghost story. It's like legitimately really a great film. And you've got films like It, which is, it hits what I call the Pixar button, where it's a film that makes you laugh, cry, cheer, be scared, dread. It runs you through all of those emotions. And Pixar movies are great at doing that, where they can make you
minus
laugh
the dread.
hysterically. Sometimes there's dread.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's fair. Finding Nemo,
But
there's
can make you laugh in equal measure as they make you cry. And that's a movie that's a thing that it does really well. I almost wish there wasn't a sequel, because the sequel didn't come close to doing justice to the first film. But I think that it's just a perfect film.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you like this video, click like. If you really like this video, click subscribe. And if you really, really like this video, click share. Because that is exactly what Jaws the shark would want you to do. Dun 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 dun.